You pressed play, but something else might be listening too. Can I ask you something? Where are you right now? And what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. Just don't listen too closely. Some things hear it when you do. It had begun subtly, like a quiet murmur, slipping through the cracks of a restless mind. Something had felt off the morning the door had been locked behind. The key turned with slightly trembling fingers. The first sign hadn't even seemed like a sign. A woman and her daughter had been browsing a cereal aisle in a small neighborhood store. The mother, somewhere in her 40s, with light curls tucked into a faded green hoodie, had been reading labels on granola boxes. Her daughter had appeared disengaged, twirling a loose string on her sleeve. Yet as steps had approached, both had turned in eerie unison. Their eyes hadn't just looked, they had fixed. Empty, cold, not furious or curious, just vacant. Their gaze had pierced, not through skin, but through presence. No words had been spoken, no smiles had been exchanged. For no more than 5 seconds, their bodies had remained still, their expressions unblinking, and just like that, they had resumed their previous activity. The moment had passed, but the unease hadn't. It had lingered like humidity on the skin, impossible to shake off, even in sunlight. Rationalization had been easy, at first. Children stared sometimes. Parents got distracted. Perhaps it had been imagined, or distorted by fatigue. But the illusion had cracked only half an hour later. The bus ride home had been uneventful, until it wasn't. Somewhere between the third and fourth stop, passengers had begun to shift. Slowly, mechanically, not toward the doors, but toward a single point, the aisle, toward the presence, walking by them. A man mid-conversation on his phone had frozen mid-gesture, hand hovering in the air, mouth open mid-word. An elderly woman had stopped digging through her purse, her fingers trapped beneath faded receipts. Their faces had been turned, but not contorted, just stilled, silently attentive. Their eyes had been dead. Stillness had fallen across their limbs like frost. A biological pause. 4 pairs of eyes, maybe 5, had remained fixed until the next stop. Feet had moved on instinct. The door had opened. Breath had returned only when the cool air outside had been inhaled. The body had moved fast, but the mind had moved faster, searching, looking for sense where there had been none. Logic had clashed with experience. Had it been hallucination, fatigue? Once home, desperate searches had followed. Disorders, seizures, neurological anomalies. None had aligned. No known syndrome had included entire strangers freezing, watching in eerie synchrony. Still, denial had offered comfort. Perhaps the stain on the shirt had drawn attention. Perhaps embarrassment had twisted perceptions. That explanation had survived the night, but it had not survived the coffee shop. The cafe had always provided comfort. It had smelled of roasted beans and warm pastries, offering familiarity in a world that no longer felt quite right. It had been colder than usual that morning, with a sharp wind slicing between buildings. Even so, the cafe's windows had been fogged slightly from within, glowing softly against the gray. The order had been simple: a large dark roast, no cream, 1 sugar, a slice of banana bread, warm crumbling at the edges. The server behind the counter had offered a brief smile while preparing the drink. Her apron had been stained with traces of espresso foam, her fingers steady and practiced. For a few brief minutes, reality had felt manageable. The unease from the bus, the store, all of it had begun to feel like a dream receding in daylight. But then, the sound had arrived. A sharp hiss, then the scent of scorched skin. At first, it had been thought to be steam escaping from the machine, but the smell had deepened, richer, acidic, unmistakably human. A dark puddle had begun to spread across the counter, running down the edge and pooling silently on the floor. Eyes had moved upward. The barista's hand had been under the spout, unmoving. The stream of coffee had poured directly onto her wrist, blistering skin visible beneath the clear drip of the liquid. There had been no reaction. Her face had been still, her eyes wide, her smile gone. She had simply stared, blank and unblinking. As the boiling liquid seared her flesh, the single tear had traced a slow path down her cheek. Nothing had moved, not her coworkers, not the customers, not even the soft jazz always playing in the background. Only silence, and the soft patter of coffee against linoleum. Flight had come instinctively. The door had been shoved open, with enough force to rattle the frame. Only after the exit had been made, once the cafe had been several steps behind, had a sound emerged. A scream, raw and guttural. It had torn through the morning air like a flare. It had been real. There had been no more denial after that. The conclusion had been undeniable. The occurrences had followed presence. Every time the surroundings had bent in unnatural ways, someone had been watching, and it had only ever happened when steps had drawn close. But this time, the pattern had shifted. There had been no stillness after the narrator had left. There had been pain and voice, a new variable, a new horror. That evening had been spent indoors. Doors locked, curtains drawn, devices powered down. Search after search had yielded no explanation. Not in psychology, not in medicine, not in theology, not in folklore. Even the darkest corners of conspiracy forums had offered nothing concrete, only questions, fragments, symbols, until the news had been turned on. Local coverage had resumed its usual rhythm. Minor crimes, petty disputes, seasonal changes. Nothing had been mentioned of the incident in the cafe. Nothing about burns or screams. Instead, a familiar anchor had sat beneath sterile lighting, lips forming words, eyes heavy with scripted boredom. Fatigue had begun to settle. The screen had dimmed slightly as drowsiness crept into limbs. But when consciousness had returned, minutes or hours later, something had been off. The image on screen had not moved. The anchor's face had remained unchanged. No cuts, no graphics, no motion. Muted perhaps. A step closer to the television had revealed something worse. The anchor's eyelid had twitched, just barely, just once. The broadcast had not been frozen. The man had simply stopped moving. Then the mouth had opened, and the voice that had emerged had not belonged to him. The voice that had escaped from the news anchor's mouth had not matched his cadence, his tone, or anything remotely human. It had rolled through the room like a weight, bending the air, pressing against the lungs with words carved from fire. The face on screen had not changed. No lips had truly moved, yet sound had been emitted. The message had been delivered in perfect clarity. Then will appear the sign of the returning one, and the condemned shall weep when the gates are unsealed, and the fire descends, not from above, but from within. There had been no source, no subtitle, no context, only that voice, and then silence. The anchor had continued to stare for several minutes after, the stillness broken only by the tiniest tremor beneath his left eye. Then the feed had abruptly cut to black. It had felt like a warning, or perhaps a sentence already passed. That night, no further risk had been taken. The television had remained off, the curtains shut tighter, the phone silenced and buried beneath a pillow. Any form of contact with the outside world had felt too dangerous, too volatile. New patterns had been documented, new theories drafted. Initially, it had been believed that physical proximity was required to trigger the frozen states, but the anchor had spoken through a screen miles away, in a sealed studio, which meant that physical distance no longer mattered. Connection alone had been enough. No texts had been sent, no online activity attempted. Screens had stayed dark. Even mirrors had been avoided. A hollow kind of isolation had settled into the days that followed. Hours had passed without event, but never without tension. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the hallway light outside the apartment door had carried weight, but it had been manageable, until the silence arrived. It had begun slowly. At first, birdsong had stopped. Then the cars that normally pass down the nearby avenue had gone unheard. Finally, even the hum of distant electricity, something always present in the background, had faded completely. The world had not gone quiet. It had gone dead. And then the light had changed. Morning had come as expected, but the sunlight that filtered through the blinds had seemed fractured, bent at odd angles, as though pushed through cracked glass. Dust motes had moved unnaturally slow in its path, their spirals too precise. A presence had been sensed long before it had been seen. The blinds had been drawn open with slow, reluctant hands. There, beyond the thin pane of glass, a figure had stood. It had been the neighbor, recognizable by the jacket he always wore and the dented thermos he carried each morning. But he had not moved. His face had been inches from the glass, eyes dry and wide, expression completely erased. Blood vessels in his eyes had burst into crimson threads. His mouth had been parted slightly, but no breath had fogged the window between them. He had simply stood, watching. No reaction had followed the sight. No scream, no questions. Only paralysis. And then the corners of his lips had twitched upward, a smile. But it had not belonged to him. The smile had remained fixed for hours, not soft, not kind, but pulled taut, like a mask stretched too far. Eventually, others had joined him. They had arrived silently, from sidewalks, from alleyways, from the empty street that had once hummed with distant life. No footsteps had been heard, no voices, just figures, each one wearing the same vacant expression, each one standing still beneath windows, facing inward. By nightfall, 7 of them had surrounded the house. By dawn, their number had doubled. Not a single one had blinked. They had not eaten, not moved, not slept. Sometimes, faint sounds had emerged, soft, indistinct, not words, but fragments, whispers caught in the throat. At times it had sounded like weeping, at others, like laughter filtered through static. Inside the home, all light had been extinguished, not by choice, but by failure. Bulbs had died one by one. Devices had refused to turn on, despite being fully charged. Even batteries had become inert, as though drained by unseen hands. Attempts had been made to call for help. Every emergency number had resulted in silence. Not a single ring, not even the sound of disconnection. Just stillness. Desperation had clawed at the walls. Rational plans had begun to form. Escape routes, supply gathering, contingency movement. But each time, the shadow of a figure at the window had shattered that momentum, because each one had been watching, and somehow it had been felt that the moment movement began, so would theirs. There had been no trust in the roads, no trust in the air, not anymore. The mirrors had been covered, the windows barricaded, but the watching had continued. Eyes closed or open, it hadn't mattered. Their gaze had been felt, like invisible hands pressing against the skull. And then, early this morning, the sun had risen without warmth. Its light had cast no shadow, and the sky had been wrong, too pale, too flat, as though something had been painted hastily over a void. It had become clear that this was no longer about escape. This was about containment. Whatever they were, their behavior had mirrored some ancient instinct, like predators circling something they didn't recognize, or worshippers awaiting a final signal. The decision had been made. There would be no running. If this was a curse, it would not be passed on. If this was an infection, it would not be spread. And if this was judgment, then it would be faced. The front door had been unlocked this morning. No figure had moved, not yet, but they had heard it. They had noticed. The air had shifted. The silence had pressed deeper. Steps had echoed down the hallway, toward the threshold, slow and deliberate. The knob had been touched, gripped. There had been no farewell, no recording, no confession, only understanding, because whatever had been watching through those blank, unblinking faces had already been inside all along. It had been the culmination of 2 exhausting years of part-time jobs and endless paperwork. Admission into the university had been earned through sheer determination, with the dorm assignment seen as just another hurdle, not a threat. Upon arrival, the dormitory had appeared like any other: aging bricks, dim corridors, and the persistent hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Nothing had seemed immediately off until the door to room 312 had been opened. A wave of stench had assaulted the air, thick, foul, almost chemical. The origin of it had been identified as something being reheated in the microwave by the current occupant, who had barely acknowledged the arrival of a new roommate. He had been introduced as Elric, a name not found in any casual roll call or social app. The food, or what passed as food, had continued to release its putrid perfume for days. Not even open windows or layers of air fresheners had been able to erase it completely. The stench had clung to the walls like a memory no one wanted to relive. Despite the olfactory assault, Elric had kept mostly to himself, rarely leaving the room and speaking only when necessary. Yet, whenever he had spoken, his voice had seemed strangely rehearsed, formal in a way that felt unearthly. There had been no contractions, no filler words, only full, stiff sentences. Over time, conversations had inevitably happened. One, in particular, had spiraled into uncomfortable territory: politics, theology, philosophy. The topics had unfolded like rotten petals, each one revealing something more bizarre. Elric had insisted that divinity was a collective hallucination, and that every human being was a god unaware of their own dominion. He had spoken of utopia, modeled after authoritarian regimes, and claimed emotional connections were distractions from personal evolution. At first, his ideas had been dismissed as immature edginess, typical contrarianism. But then he had begun referencing something more structured: an organization that operated outside conventional systems, an assembly, he had said, that sought to stabilize disorder where governments failed. It had sounded delusional at worst, harmless at best. The first real alarm had sounded in early March. Elric had been summoned to the administrative office. Word had circulated that agents had arrived, federal, not campus security. He had returned that evening silent, typing furiously on his laptop while ignoring any attempts at communication. Days later, a second visit had followed. Curiosity had turned into fear. Late one afternoon, while wandering the campus with a classmate named Jonah, a discovery had been made. A bulletin board near the west wing of the science building had displayed a flyer, black and white, poorly printed, and deeply unsettling. Figures had stood cloaked in ivory robes, their faces hidden behind symmetrical masks with no eye holes. At the center of the flyer had been a strange symbol: 4 jagged edges surrounding a central eye, not unlike certain band sigils from old regimes. The bottom of the flyer had read, "Join us, be the flame that consumes the chaos." A link had been provided, though the domain had been blurred by someone with a black marker. Jonah had laughed nervously, but the smile had faded when attention had returned to a certain fabric flag hanging above Elric's bed. Same symbol, and the mask on his wall, once dismissed as a cultural piece, had matched those worn by the figures in the flyer. From that moment, denial had no longer been an option. The room had begun to change after that realization, or perhaps perception had shifted. The walls had seemed to close in slightly, the corners darker than they had any right to be, as if shadow clung to them longer than natural. Elric's schedule had grown more erratic. There had been nights when typing had persisted past 3 a.m., the rhythmic clatter of his mechanical keyboard echoing like static in the silence. A faint red glow from his laptop screen had bathed his face in unnatural hues, as though lit from beneath by something otherworldly. Each morning, evidence of his nightly activities had been found scattered across his desk, scribbled pages with symbols that weren't part of any known alphabet, screenshots of encrypted forums, and once a single black feather that hadn't been there the night before. Attempts to ask him to reduce the noise or dim the lights had been met with indifference, or worse, responses that had felt like rehearsed dismissals. The words had been spoken, but the emotions behind them had been hollow. A silent barrier had grown between the two beds. Communication had ceased entirely. Meals had been eaten in silence. The room had ceased being shared. It had been divided. One half had remained barely touched, while the other had transformed into a shrine to something unnamed. What had once been annoyance had evolved into fear. Further investigation had been attempted. A reverse image search of the flyer's symbol had yielded results buried deep in internet archives. Obscure sites referencing failed cults, unsolved disappearances, and references to a clandestine group known only as the Fourth Mirror. The descriptions had matched too closely. The robes, the masks, the ideology of purification through isolation. The group had allegedly operated under the belief that reality was fractured and needed to be rebuilt through acts of calculated disorder. Members had claimed to be architects of collapse. That same night, Elric had received another envelope slipped under the door, thick, sealed with red wax, no postage or markings. The seal had bore the same four-pronged eye. He had opened it without hesitation and read its contents with unnerving calm. Hours later, the typing had resumed. Sleep had become impossible. Every creak of the bed frame, every keyboard click, had sounded like a warning. It had felt as if something invisible had been occupying the room with them, breathing just out of reach. Then, one morning a faint hum had awakened the narrator, soft at first, but rising in volume like a machine powering up. A glow had pulsed beneath Elric's bed, faintly violet, flickering like a heartbeat. No explanation had ever been offered. Elric had simply continued with his day. The following week, a small group of students had vanished from campus. Their absence had not been publicly acknowledged, but rumors had spread like spilled ink. It had been said they had last been seen near the old theater hall. That same evening, Elric's robe, once hidden in his closet, had been found draped openly over his chair. The robe had not been made of any fabric that could be readily identified. Its surface had shimmered subtly under artificial light, not in the way of silk or satin, but as if hundreds of fine translucent threads had been woven into it, threads that reflected nothing yet suggested depth. A scent had clung to it, metallic and damp, like the inside of an old cellar. From that night on, strange occurrences had accelerated. The mirror above the shared sink had developed a thin crack, though no force had ever been applied to it. The digital clock had begun resetting itself every night to 4:16 a.m., no matter how often it had been corrected. The laptop, Elric's ever-clicking companion, had once displayed a screen covered in static and looping lines of code, repeating one phrase that had made the blood run cold. The eye sees who endures. An attempt had been made to report him again, but the campus RA had responded differently this time, less receptive, almost dismissive. It had been noted that Elric's tuition had been paid in full through an obscure scholarship no one else had ever heard of. A file had existed for him, but parts of it had been redacted. No previous school had been listed. No emergency contacts had been recorded. Days had passed, heavy and slow. Meals had lost their taste. Sleep, when achieved, had been laced with images of rooms that shouldn't exist, and staircases that had led nowhere. It had been during one such night, as consciousness drifted between dream and waking, that a sound had been heard low, guttural chanting, not from outside, but from within the room. When eyes had opened, Elric had been sitting on the floor, his back straight, legs crossed, hands resting palms up on his knees. His mouth had moved, but no sound had matched the motion. The voice had come from everywhere at once, above, beneath, within. The walls had rippled, the air had thickened. And then, just as quickly as it had started, silence had returned. Elric had stood and resumed typing. By this point, paranoia had nested in the narrator's chest like a parasite. Every movement had been calculated. Every object had been inspected. A phone had been left charging on the desk one evening. By morning, the charging cable had been severed cleanly in half, with no marks of struggle or melting. Later that week, while walking across campus, another flyer had been noticed, this one posted behind the glass of a locked display case. The symbol had evolved slightly. The eye had been wider now, with small cracks radiating outward like a web. The words beneath it had shifted. The thread unravels for those who look too long. A message had been understood. That night, a final attempt to document the madness had been made. The room had been photographed. Elric's wall, the flag, the open laptop, the strange garment. But when reviewed, the photos had come out warped. Entire sections had been blurred unnaturally, with segments replaced by static or pitch-black voids. The only clear photo had been the last, a picture taken of the door from inside the room. Standing just behind the narrator's shoulder, faint, grainy, barely visible, had been a figure draped in white, face hidden behind a cracked mask. Elric had been asleep when the photo was taken. After that night, the room had ceased to feel like a place rooted in reality. The boundaries between waking and dreaming had eroded completely. Time had stopped behaving normally. Mornings had arrived before sleep, and nights had stretched on endlessly, measured only by the blinking cursor of Elric's monitor and the pounding heart in the narrator's chest. No longer had Elric seemed merely strange. His movements had begun to change. He had walked with a rhythm that didn't match the floor's natural creak, each step sounding delayed, like a playback, just slightly out of sync. Whispers had begun to bleed through the vents, not words, just soft, rustling sounds, like breath trying to form meaning. A decision had finally been made. Evidence had been compiled again. Screenshots of the corrupted images, a written account of the chanting, of the flyers, of the changes in Elric's behavior. A second meeting with the RAA had been demanded, this time with more urgency, more insistence. But the office had been locked, and when it had finally been entered, it had been found empty. Not just unoccupied, empty, as if no one had ever worked there. The desk had been bare. The shelves had held only dust. A hollow feeling had settled in the gut. Returning to the dorm had felt like a march into a tomb. Yet it had been done. That night, every light had been left on. The door had been locked. A chair had been wedged beneath the handle. And yet, at exactly 4:16 a.m., the lights had flickered once and gone out. When the laptop had turned itself on in the dark, the screen had displayed nothing but a live camera feed of the room itself from above, from a vantage point that did not exist. The narrator had been visible, curled under the blanket, while Elric had not been in his bed. He had been standing in the corner, still, watching. No breath had been visible from him, no motion, just presence. When the screen had gone black, the silence that followed had screamed. It had taken everything to wait for dawn. The next day, action had finally been taken. The dean's office had been contacted directly. Documentation had been presented. The phrase "possible threat to student safety" had been used, and something had shifted in the administrator's expression. A few hours later, campus security had entered room 312. Elric had not resisted. He had not spoken. He had simply followed with a smile that did not belong to any sane person. The room had been searched. A small compartment beneath his bed had been found, containing a white mask, smooth porcelain, cracked on the left cheek, and a blade wrapped in cloth and bearing unfamiliar carvings. Also recovered had been several envelopes, each sealed in wax, each addressed with only numbers and arcane symbols. When asked for a forwarding address, none had been available. When questioned by agents, Elric had stated only one thing, repeated several times in perfect calm. The fourth mirror has opened. The pattern will be fulfilled. He had been removed from the premises. The room had been reassigned, the bed stripped, the walls repainted, but something had remained. Nights had continued to stretch thin, even in the new dorm. Reflections in the mirror had lagged behind movements by a split second. Digital clocks had reset again. And once, while walking past a bulletin board on the other side of campus, a single flyer had been seen. The EAA remembers. The symbol had been fainter now, almost erased, but the crack around the eye had widened.